Imagine this for a second. You walk into a coffee shop that you visit regularly, and over time they give you one of those loyalty cards where every purchase earns a stamp. And once you collect 10 stamps, you get a free coffee, which seems simple enough when you first receive it. Now, let's say you've already collected 8 stamps, so you're close to that reward. And at this point, those stamps don't feel like a promotion anymore. They feel like something you've already earned, something that's quietly sitting there waiting to be completed. And then, one day, without warning, they tell you those 8 stamps are gone, and you have to start again from zero. That moment doesn't feel neutral. It doesn't feel like you're just not getting a free coffee. It feels like something was taken away from you. But if you pause and reverse the situation, and imagine they had simply given you 8 stamps for free on your first visit, it wouldn't feel anywhere near as good as losing those 8 feels bad. Same outcome, same value, but completely different emotional weight. So clearly, your reaction is not based on value. It's based on something deeper. You can see this much more clearly in something simple, like your bank balance. Because if your account drops from $1,000 to $900, that change feels immediate and noticeable, almost like your brain zooms in on it and keeps replaying it. But if it goes from $900 to $1,000, the feeling is there, but it's softer, shorter, and easier to forget. And this happens even though the numbers are identical, which means your brain is not reacting to money itself, but to the direction of change relative to what it believes is normal for you. And the moment something becomes part of that sense of, this is what I have, losing it creates a much stronger reaction than gaining it ever will. Underneath all of this, your brain is constantly maintaining a kind of invisible baseline, a reference point that defines what your current state feels like. And every experience you have is measured against that baseline rather than evaluated on its own. So if something pushes you above that line, it feels like a gain. And if something pulls you below it, it feels like a loss. But what makes this complicated is that this baseline is not stable. It shifts quietly, often without you noticing. And once it shifts upward, even slightly, things that would have felt normal before now start to feel like losses simply because they fall below that new expectation. And this is where perception begins to separate from reality, because you can be objectively fine and still feel like you're losing. You see this play out very clearly when people get a raise, because at first, the increase feels meaningful and noticeable, but over time, the new income level becomes normal, and their expectations adjust to match it. Their spending adjusts, their lifestyle adjusts, and slowly, without any conscious decision, their baseline moves upward. Now imagine that same income drops back down. Even if they are still earning more than they did a year ago, it feels like a loss. Not because of the absolute number, but because of where their baseline has moved. So what changed was not reality. It was the reference point. And once that shifts, your experience follows it. Now, this becomes much more powerful when you realize that for something to feel like a loss, your brain first has to treat it as something you own. And ownership is not nearly as concrete as we tend to assume. You don't need to pay for something for it to feel like yours, because simply interacting with it, customizing it, or getting used to having it available is often enough for your brain to include it in your baseline. So when you start using a product on a free trial, for example, you might think you're just exploring it temporarily. But as you save things, adjust settings, or build even a small habit around it, your brain quietly updates its expectation. And now that product is no longer external. It becomes part of your normal environment. So when the trial ends, the decision is no longer about whether it's worth paying for. It becomes about whether you're willing to lose something that already feels like yours. Then time deepens this effect in a way that is easy to overlook, because the more consistently something shows up in your life, the more it shifts from being optional to being expected. You stop thinking about whether to use it, and instead start assuming that it will be there when you need it, which means it quietly becomes part of your routine. And routines are not just about convenience. They are about stability. They reduce the number of decisions your brain has to make, and once something contributes to that stability, your brain starts protecting it, even if the original value is no longer significant. So when you consider removing it, you're not just evaluating the product, you're disrupting a pattern. And that disruption feels uncomfortable enough to avoid. There's another layer underneath this that makes it even harder to notice, and that is the idea of optionality. If you look at your subscriptions right now, there's a high chance that at least one of them is something you barely use, and yet you continue paying for it month after month. Not because it's providing consistent value, but because it represents an option, the possibility that you might use it in the future. And losing that possibility feels like closing a door, even if you never intended to walk through it. So what you're really paying for is not usage. It's the removal of a small imagined future limitation. And that imagined loss feels bigger than the real cost. When you combine all of these layers, shifting baselines, perceived ownership, routine stability, and optionality, your decisions start to drift away from value and toward protection. You're no longer asking what is better. You're asking what feels safer to keep. And this shows up in places that matter much more than subscriptions. People hold on to losing investments because selling forces them to accept a loss relative to their reference point. People stay in roles that no longer suit them because leaving feels like giving something up, even when the alternative is objectively better. So decisions become anchored to the past instead of directed toward the future. And that's where the cost becomes real. Once you start looking at it this way, it becomes difficult to ignore how often this pattern is intentionally used, because many systems are not designed to prove value in a straightforward way, but instead designed to quietly move your baseline upward and let your own psychology do the rest. Free trials are long enough for habits to form. Products are designed to integrate into your routine quickly. And cancellation is just inconvenient enough to delay action, not because it has to be, but because even small delays are enough when your brain is already biased toward avoiding loss. So over time, you're not actively choosing to keep things. You're passively maintaining a state that was constructed for you. So the only reliable way to deal with this is not by trying to push yourself to make better decisions in the moment, but by removing the distortion before the decision even happens. A simple way to do that is to mentally reset your baseline and ask a different question. If this disappeared today, would I actually choose to pay to get it back tomorrow? Because the moment you ask that, you remove the sense of ownership, the routine, and the imagined future use. And what remains is a much clearer view of whether it's actually worth keeping. And in many cases, the answer becomes obvious much faster than you expect. Once you start seeing this pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee, because you begin to realize that a surprising number of things you maintain in your life are not there because they are valuable, but because losing them feels uncomfortable. And that discomfort, more than logic, is what drives the decision. In the next video, we're going to build on this by looking at something even more subtle, which is how cognitive load quietly prevents you from acting at all, even when you already know what the right decision is.